Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of A Different Point of View. I'm KonateLilas, your host, and without further ado, let's get into today's topic. So today I want to talk about critical race theory. It is a source of great frustration for me, and mainly because of the misinformation campaign that is conducted by the far conservative right. They will have you believe that critical race theory teaches racism. It teaches Americans how to hate each other. It teaches black boys and black girls how to hate. It teaches us that white people are evil by their nature and by their very whiteness, and that black children are perpetual victims, and that it divides society into the oppressors and the oppressed. This is what they will have you believe.
The old Marxism used economics to gain control. The new Marxism uses identity politics. And the result is something that looks nothing like America. There's no reason to believe that this new Marxism will result in anything but what the old Marxism resulted in.
Critical race theory is racism, pure and simple. And it should be rejected by every American of every race.
And let me tell you right now, critical race theory is bigoted, it is a lie, and it is every bit as racist as the Klansmen in white sheets.
And every time I debate critical race theory, my knockout punch is always, did you actually take the time out to read what critical race theory is? Do you even know what critical race theory is? I mean, if you're going to be so impassioned about something, if this is something that is such a source of great consternation to you, that you're going to get teachers fired, you're going to scream and yell at school board meetings, and you're going to have states change laws and have states ban critical race theory, if you're going to do that, at least know what it is. At least listen to the founders of critical race theory. Listen to Derek Bell. Listen to Kimberly Crenshaw. Listen to what they have to say. If you're going to hate it so much, at least, I mean, we live in a time of Google. You can just type in Google and it comes right up. Find out. Because critical race theory, it is not what the conservative Republicans are saying that it is. So since you don't know, or since most of us don't know what critical race theory is, let me tell you what it actually is. Critical race theory gives us a different lens on how to look at racism. So the problem is that when most of us look at racism, and when a lot of white people look at racism, they look at racism very explicitly. So if you use the N-word, you are a racist. If you are part of a racial hate group, you are a racist. If you talk ill or disparagingly of people because they're black, you are a racist. And if you don't do those things, if you don't participate in those explicit activities, well then you're not a racist. And if you even have a few black friends, well that means that you are absolved of all racism. And that is a very explicit way of looking at racism. See, when we want to define racism, or should I say when we want to look at how racist America is or how how racist America is not. It depends upon how you define racism. So if you define it that explicitly, well, then you may feel that racism is over-exaggerated in America. That's fine. But critical race theory broadens how we look at racism. Critical race theory looks at racism more implicitly. Because if you look at it so explicitly, what happens is that you have a very low bar as to not being racist. But critical race theory says, well, let's look at it more implicitly. Let's look at it more subconsciously. Let's look at it systemically. And let's look at it institutionally. Critical race theory argues that racism is baked into the institutions of our society. So, and critical race theory tries to answer a very fundamental question, and that question is, 157 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Black people in America are still dealing with huge inequalities, with huge disparities with regards to education, with regards to housing, with regards to income, with regards to wealth, with regards to economic power, political power, social power. There are still huge disparities. And why do we have these huge disparities? 157 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, decades after Jim Crow, decades after segregation, decades after the Civil Rights Act was passed, the Voting Rights was passed, all of these barriers to explicit racism are now, for the most part, gone. We even had a Black president. But collectively, why do we still have these problems? And critical race theory makes an attempt to answer that question. Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the founders of critical race theory and a Columbia professor, she does a very good job at defining what critical race theory is and actually is not.
Look, you know what? Here's the thing, Joy. Critical race theory is not so much a thing. It's a way of looking at a thing. It's a way of looking at race. It's a way of looking at why, after so many decades, centuries actually, since the emancipation, we have patterns of inequality that are enduring. They are stubborn. And the point of critical race theory originally was to think and talk about how law contributed to the subordinate status of African Americans, of indigenous people, and of an entire group of people who were coming to our shores from Asia. And the point was, quite frankly, to understand the problem in order to intervene in it, to understand why the greatest hopes for our republic were not being realized, even though these hopes were encoded in law. So critical race theory just inherits the beliefs and the hopes of Frederick Douglass, of Martin Luther King, who basically want the law to do for the freed people what the law did for enslavers. And we picked that up in the 70s and 80s after the civil rights movement to say, okay, so now we've had this big civil rights movement. We have all these laws in the books, but things really aren't looking as different as they should if we are really the society that we say we are. So we put about the task of understanding how law wasn't just the neutral referee. Law wasn't always on our side. In fact, law was less on our side than for on our side. And we wanted to tell these stories in order to do better with the promises that are embedded in the Constitution. That's what's in critical race theory.
So let's say, and let's be hypothetical. So let's say that you got rid of all bad white people. No more white people exist, but you still have bad policies. Are Black people in this country still going to face these disparities, still going to face these inequalities? Are you still going to have these major gaps that fall along racial lines? Let's take it up a notch. Let's say that you got rid of all of the racist white people. There's no more racist white people in America. Every white people is loving and colorblind and open-minded and just anti-racist. But you still have racist policies. Are you still going to have these disparities in America? And when I say racist policies, when I say bad policies, what I mean by that is that policies that disproportionately affect black people in a negative way. See, we like to think that laws are objective, right? You have a law and you break the law, you deal with the consequences of that law, and it doesn't matter what race you are, what color you are. None of those things matter because laws are objective. Well, are laws really objective? Well, critical race theory challenges that. Are there laws that have affected more black people than anyone else? Critical race theory also asks the question of, does the impact of Jim Crow, does the impact of slavery, does that still have a negative effect on black people today in 2022? These are the things that critical race theory is trying to address. So let me tell you more in more explicit terms what critical race theory is not. It is not this notion that we are teaching children in elementary schools how to be racist. First of all, if you actually bother to read what critical race theory is, it is actually a concept that was brought about in the 1970s, quite frankly, before I was even born. And one of the founders, Derek Bell, who was a Harvard professor, one of the first black tenured professors in Harvard, he was basically teaching it in law school. Critical race theory is something that is taught in law school. It is not taught in schools.
Is there a K through 12 curriculum on critical race theory that's being taught in schools around this?
So I just find it fascinating that schools are banning something that wasn't there in the first place. No state Department of Education can show me where critical race theory exists in their curriculum. In order for a high school or middle school to give an academic credit towards graduation, that course has to be in the state's curriculum. If it's not in the state's curriculum, or it's not in the state's guidelines of courses, then you can't get a credit for it. So you're banning something that's not even in there. It's not taught in K-12 schools. It's not, and if you read what Derek Bell wrote, if you look up what the founders, there's nowhere in attendance that says anything about white people are evil and inherently evil. It's not in there anywhere. So if that is the case, then why are we intentionally giving misinformation about it? So I mean, we have to put that question out there. And the only thing that I can come up with is that after the George Floyd situation and the riots and things of that nature, there was a there's a racial awakening that was happening in America, and that is still taking place. There's a racial awakening taking place in America, and there are a lot of people that are uncomfortable, and there are a lot of people on the conservative Republican right that are very uncomfortable with this racial awakening that takes place. So to sabotage this racial awakening, to assuage white guilt, to accommodate these white fragilities that we have, they're purposely lying about what it is, and they're lying about what it is not. So those are my thoughts, YouTube. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please support the merch. They like our rhythm, but not our blues. Please support the merch. And like, share, and subscribe. And thank you for tuning in to another episode of A Different Point of View. Please like, comment, share, subscribe. Give me your comments. Peace. The chair is yours, YouTube. Please comment.